Have you ever looked at your parents, especially if you haven't seen them in a while, and thought, damn, they're getting old? And suddenly the subtle fear creeps up on you. Not necessarily because anything is wrong, maybe they're completely fine. Maybe your dad just has a few more gray hairs than the last time you saw him. Maybe your mom has a few more wrinkles around their eyes. Maybe they walk a little slower. But for the first time, you don't just see them as your parents. You see them as people getting older. And then comes the thought you spend most of your life trying not to think about. One day, they're not gonna be there anymore. It's a horrible realization. I think most of us internalize that fear the moment we're old enough to truly understand death. Before that, death is almost an abstract concept, something that happens in films, something that happens to old people, something that happens somewhere else. But eventually, you understand that your parents aren't immortal. And the older you get, the more real that becomes. It takes a long time to make peace with this horrible aspect of reality. Maybe you never completely do, but I think eventually you learn something important. You learn to enjoy them more. You stop taking every phone call, every dinner, every stupid argument, and every random conversation for granted, because one day you'll probably wish you could have one more of them. As a child, your parents feel like they're always going to be there. They are just there. You wake up and they're there, you get sick and they're there. You fall, hurt yourself, have a nightmare, get scared of something under your bed. Somehow they're there. For most of your childhood, your parents aren't really people in the same way everyone else is. They're more like permanent fixtures of reality, like the walls of your house. You don't wake up every morning wondering whether the walls are still going to be there. You just assume they will. And that's how you see your parents. You don't entertain the idea that one day they might not be around. Then you become a teenager and suddenly you can't wait to get away from them. They annoy you, you're embarrassed to be seen with them, you fight all the time. They refuse to treat you like an adult, while deep down you still feel like a kid who has absolutely no idea what he's doing. You want freedom. You want them to stop asking where you're going, stop asking when you're coming back, stop telling you to clean your room, stop giving you advice you didn't ask for. And of course, you become convinced that they're completely out of touch with reality. You don't understand. Every teenager has probably said some version of that. And the funny thing is that, from their perspective, they probably heard it before. Because chances are they said exactly the same thing to their parents. I think the first major shift happens when you go to university, move out, or get your first proper job. Suddenly, expectations are higher, consequences feel more real, and you start understanding what it actually means not to have your parents fixing every mess you make. The very act of living by yourself teaches you an incredible amount. The fridge will remain empty until you go and buy groceries, no matter how many times you open it and close and hoping that something magically appeared. The laundry won't magically wash itself, it definitely won't iron itself, and unfortunately, nobody's going to fold it and leave it neatly on your bed after you throw your clothes on the bathroom floor. The house will remain a mess until you grab a broom, a mop, and put some elbow grease into it. Nobody's coming to save you from the dishes, nobody's going to change the bed sheets, nobody's coming to figure out what's for dinner every single day. And then you start remembering all those things your parents did that you never even noticed. How many meals they cooked, how many times they cleaned up after you, how many problems they solved before you even realized there was a problem. That's probably one of the weirdest things about becoming an adult. You don't fully understand how much your parents did for you until you had to start doing those things yourself. And it sucks. There's no sugarcoating around it. But it's also one of those defining moments in life. The ones that generally help determine the kind of person you turn out to be. Because at some point, you have to learn that there isn't always going to be someone behind you ready to catch you. Sometimes you're the one who has to become the person everyone relies on. And that's why I think going back home feels particularly sweet. You start appreciating all those little things you once couldn't wait to escape from. Opening the fridge and finding food, someone asking if you've eaten, your favorite meal somehow appearing on the table, having clean towels without remembering when they were washed. But it's not just the practical stuff. Your relationship with your parents changes. It feels different to interact with them. At some point, it becomes normal again to hang out with them. You might want to introduce your partner to the family and desperately hope they like them as much as you do. You enjoy going out for dinner together. You go on holidays together. You can finally have deeper conversations about your career, your relationships, your mistakes, your plans, and even your love life. For the first time, you get to know them as actual people, not just as mom and dad. You hear stories about what they were like before you existed, the stupid things they did when they were young, their first jobs, their first heartbreaks, their own fights with their parents, and suddenly you realize something quite obvious that somehow never crossed your mind as a child. They were young ones too. They were probably just as confused as you are now. Maybe they also thought they had life figured out when they were 25, only to realize 10 years later that they absolutely didn't. It's refreshing, almost like finally seeing their friendly side of them because they're no longer primarily worried about educating you. They'll always care, of course. That never stops. I think that's one of the strangest things about being a parent. Apparently, you can have a 30-year-old child with their own job, their own house, and their own family, and you'll still worry whether they've eaten enough. But now you get to enjoy some of the best aspects of your relationship with them. You visit them when you want, you leave when you want, or you stay for as long as you want. And hopefully, the relationship becomes less about parent and child and more about two adults who genuinely enjoy each other's company. But there's a flip side. By not living with them anymore and only seeing them every once in a while, the changes hit harder. When you see someone every day, you barely notice them aging. It's gradual, almost invisible. But when months pass between visits, it's different. You suddenly notice gray hair that wasn't there before, wrinkles you don't remember seeing. Maybe they walk a little slower, maybe getting up from the sofa takes a little more effort. Maybe their memory isn't quite as sharp as it used to be. And that's when it hits you. They're getting old. Not old in the abstract sense. Not, yeah, technically my parents are older than me. Actually getting old. You might notice your dad struggling with something he used to do effortlessly. Your mom might mention a pain she's been having, and suddenly your brain starts doing what brains do best, going from zero to catastrophic in about 3 seconds. She says, "Oh, it's probably nothing," and you're thinking, okay, but what if it's not nothing? Then you ask your parents about it, and they act like it's nothing, usually out of pride, which somehow makes you worry 10 times more. You start wondering whether it's time to schedule some tests, just to make sure. But then there's the other side of the dilemma. What if you find something? What if it was better not knowing? Except, of course, that's not really true either, because waiting could mean missing something you could have caught earlier. And now you're stuck in this horrible mental loop between being terrified of finding out and terrified of not finding out soon enough. It's an awful dilemma. And what makes it even more frustrating is when your parents refuse to do anything about it. You tell them they should get checked. They tell you, "I'm fine," which ironically is probably the exact reason why you should insist. The roles slowly start changing. The people who spend their entire lives telling you what to do now need you to remind them to book an appointment. The people who took you to the doctor when you were sick now tell you they're fine when you can clearly see they're not feeling great. And that's a bizarre moment because you start feeling responsible for the people who spend their entire lives being responsible for you. But what actually drives that fear? That's the question that fascinates me the most. Obviously, you love your parents. Of course, the idea of losing someone you love is terrifying. But I think there's also something more selfish underneath. Your parents represent, in a way, the older generation, the old guard, if you will. As long as they're around, you can still consider yourself part of the younger generation. Even when you're 30, 40, maybe even 50, you're still someone's child. And there is something strangely comforting about that. You might have your own house, your own job, your own responsibilities. You might even have children of your own. But when you're with your parents, a small part of you can still feel like a kid. And the fact that you start looking, and in some cases acting, a little bit like them doesn't exactly soften the pill. You suddenly catch yourself saying something your dad always used to say, or getting annoyed by something your mom does, only to realize you do exactly the same thing. And that's terrifying, but also kind of beautiful. You notice their face in yours, their expressions, their gestures. Maybe your laugh sounds like theirs. Maybe your children look like them too. It's a reminder that you're part of something that existed long before you arrived. But your parents are also your safety net. No matter how old you are, there can always be a psychological comfort in knowing they're there. Maybe they'll help you if everything goes wrong. Maybe they'll support you when you're struggling. Maybe if something completely unexpected happens, you know there is still somewhere you can go. A roof over your head, a familiar voice, someone who knew you before you became whoever you are today. When they're gone, I imagine it can feel like a vacuum is opened in your life. And that's probably why losing your parents can feel so fundamentally different from losing other people. It's not just losing the person, it's losing part of your history, your childhood, your connection to the version of yourself that nobody else remembers. Your parents remember you before your first memories even existed. They knew you when you couldn't talk, when you couldn't walk, when you had absolutely no personality except crying because someone gave you the wrong color cup. There is no replacement for that. You can form a family of your own, you can have a partner, children, friends, and all of those relationships can be incredibly meaningful, but none of them can literally replace the people who were there at the beginning. And then there is another uncomfortable aspect: mortality. In a twisted way, when your parents get older, your own mortality becomes much harder to ignore. For most of your life, death is something you project onto an older generation. It's somewhere further down the line, but eventually the line gets shorter. You start realizing that you're not standing at the beginning anymore. You're somewhere in the middle. And one day, you become the older generation. You become the old guard. And there will be someone younger looking at you and thinking, damn, they're getting old. And honestly, being the responsible adult is generally frightening, especially today. There are bills, work, rent or a mortgage, career decisions, relationships, maybe children, maybe people depending on you. And finding someone you love and trust enough to share the burden with is a hell of a challenge. So when you do, hold on to them. Because life becomes significantly harder when you're carrying everything alone. Having a sick parent, caring for an aging parent, or losing one can also feel incredibly isolating. Even when people around you try to understand, they can't fully understand what that relationship meant to you. And grief isn't something you can just get over. You don't wake up one morning and think, right, that's done, back to normal. I don't think there is a normal after something like that. There is just a new version of your life that you slowly learn how to live with. And that's why having a strong support system matters so much, because some experiences are generally too heavy to carry alone. Losing a parent can truly break you if you don't find a healthy way to deal with it. And in a strange way, these experiences can fast track the transition into adulthood. One moment, you're still someone's kid, the next, you're dealing with hospitals, paperwork, difficult decisions, and problems you never imagined having to deal with. Nobody prepares you for that. No school teaches you how to handle it. There isn't an exam you can pass that makes you emotionally ready. You just have to figure it out, like every generation before you. And I think that's what makes becoming an adult so frightening. At some point, you realize your parents weren't superheroes. They were just people. People trying their best, making mistakes, getting things wrong, probably being terrified half the time, and somehow still managing to raise another human being. When you realize that, you might become a little more forgiving of them. Because maybe they didn't have everything figured out either. Maybe they were just doing the best they could with the knowledge, money, patience, and emotional capacity they had at the time. And then, if you decide to have children yourself, I imagine the whole thing comes full circle. Suddenly, you understand why your parents made certain choices, why they worried so much, why they called you, why they wanted to know where you were, why they couldn't sleep when you were late coming home. From only having to think about yourself, you suddenly become responsible for another life. Another human being entirely relies on you to eat, to drink, to sleep, to poop, and basically to stay alive for at least a good few years. That's a ridiculous amount of responsibility when you actually think about it. You can barely remember where you put your keys, and now you're expected to keep a tiny human alive? And somehow, billions of people have managed to do it. Not perfectly, definitely not perfectly, but well enough for humanity to still be here. And maybe that's when you finally understand that fear your parents carried for you. Because loving someone unconditionally comes with a price. You gain something incredibly beautiful, but you also gain an entirely new set of fears. Now there's someone you would do absolutely anything for, and therefore there is something you can lose that would completely destroy you. Maybe that's the cruel trade off. The deeper your capacity to love, the deeper your capacity to suffer. But people keep doing it anyway. Generation after generation, parents raise children. Those children grow up, leave home, become adults, and watch their own parents get older. Then some of them become parents themselves, and the circle continues. Maybe that's because, despite all the anxiety, all the sleepless nights, and eventually all the grief, the experience is still worth it. It must be. Otherwise, we probably would have stopped doing it a long time ago. In the end, your parents are your first point of contact with the world. From the day you're born, they're there. They become your first teachers, your first protectors, your first safety net. And for better or worse, they become some of the first pillars you build your entire life around. So it's not surprising that watching them get old is such a tough watch. You want them to live forever. You want them always to be by your side, always one phone call away, always there if something goes wrong. And the idea of not being able to do that anymore is horrendous, because a small part of you might never fully recover from losing them. There is no replacement for your parents. You can love other people, you can build new relationships, you can create your own family, but you can't go back and replace the people who gave you your beginning. And maybe that's why this fear becomes stronger as we get older, because eventually you understand that time isn't infinite. One day there will be a last dinner, a last holiday, a last phone call, a last stupid argument that seemed completely unimportant at the time. And the worst part is that you probably won't know it's the last one when it's happening, which is terrifying. But maybe that's also the point. You can't spend every moment terrified that you're going to lose them. If you do, you miss the time you still have. You can't stop time. You can't keep your parents young forever. None of us can. All you can really do is appreciate them while they're here. Call them, visit them, listen to their stories, even if you've heard them 20 times before. Ask them questions about their lives, take pictures together, maybe even record their voices. Because one day, those things might become more valuable than you could possibly imagine. And yes, watching your parents getting old sucks. There really is no better way of putting it. It's scary, it's unfair, and it forces you to confront a reality you'd rather ignore. But maybe growing up is partly about accepting that the people who once protected you from everything can't protect you from this. At some point, you had to face it yourself. And maybe one day, if you're lucky enough, you'll understand it from the other side too. You'll become a parent yourself, and suddenly you'll understand why they worried. Why they were annoying, why they called too much, why they wanted to know if you got home safely. And maybe you look at your own child one day and realize that in your mind, they're still the little person you once had to teach how to eat, drink, poop, and basically stay alive. No matter how old they get, maybe that's the thing. You never really stop being someone's child. And as long as your parents are here, no matter how old you are, a small part of you can still feel like one. And honestly, maybe that's something we should appreciate while we still can.